I used to think family dinners were sacred, a time when laughter echoed and memories were created, but that all changed when Uncle Greg, who has an uncanny ability to slip venomous remarks into jovial conversations, decided to comment on my smile. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday evening. My mother had spent the entire day cooking her famous lasagna while my father polished his collection of vintage wine, and the aroma normally brought me a sense of comfort. As we gathered around the oversized table, my mother's excitement was palpable as she presented the meal, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the chill that settled in the air as Uncle Greg leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "What happened to your smile, anyway? It looks different." At that moment, a thunderbolt struck within me. My mind raced back to the summer I turned 14, the summer my childhood was ripped from me when I discovered Vine, a predator masquerading as a social media platform where I was the star of ridicule with a series of leaked videos that showcased my awkwardness and strange, crooked grin, dictated by the braces that had turned me into a target for the school bullies. Laughter had morphed into tears, and that distant, carefree girl was just a haunting memory as my smile had become a mask for my pain, a fragile shield behind which I'd concealed years of insecurity and self-loathing. I froze, feeling the eyes of my entire family on me. The youngest cousins were giggling by the dessert plates, my older sister was nervously flicking her gaze between me and my uncle, and my parents were exchanging worried looks, as if they could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface, the air thick with tension waiting to burst. Then, before I knew it, the acidic words were spilling from my mouth like a torrent. "What's wrong with my smile?" The table fell silent, forks paused midair, and for a fraction of a second, time felt suspended. Uncle Greg chuckled, half in jest and half in malice. "What happened to the girl who used to light up the room with that dorky grin?" I could see it then, the flicker of glee in his eyes as if my vulnerability nourished him. In that instant, the jubilant laughter of the evening faded into an oppressive silence, and with every ounce of grief I harbored, I vented, unleashing suppressed anger and frustration that spiraled into a whirlwind of words, attacking not just Greg but the entire facade of family gatherings, laying bare the scars that were traditionally covered with laughter. Do you think I want to be reminded of how different I am? Of the countless nights I spent crying in front of a mirror wishing to fit in? And as I spoke, it was as though a dam broke. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the shock of the sudden outburst tangling their hearts in conflicting emotions. My mother looked hurt, as though I'd pulled back the curtain on a family secret, while my father, usually the peacemaker, sat, wide-eyed, surprised at the tempest that had erupted from his adoring daughter. Then it happened. My sister, usually the calmest of us all, stepped in, her face pale as she bitterly remarked, "You're not a walking tragedy. Get a grip. This is just a dinner." The words snapped like a rubber band, ricocheting through the room and into every soul present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What was once an ambient family gathering had transformed into a battleground where everyone was armed with unspoken feelings. It felt surreal, our laughter replaced by an awkwardness thick enough to slice. I felt lost, standing amidst the wreckage of my own emotions, the insult consuming me, gnawing at my insides. I could see my uncle's pleasure, feeding on the drama he had awakened, and it infuriated me further. Why couldn't they understand that family should be a sanctuary, a place I could shield myself from the world's cruelties? And when I finally saw my father's gaze, a mix of pity and disappointment, I realized I had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The dinner plates were forgotten, the clinking of utensils was replaced by my heaving breaths, and the tension became palpable, everyone holding their breath, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Then Mom, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and sorrow, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "You've ruined this dinner, all of you. Greg, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, and you." She turned to me, disappointment etched across her features. "You should know better than to let it get to you. We're family." I gaped, the weight of it hitting me like a freight train. I had acted out, sure, but so had Uncle Greg, yet somehow, I was the villain in this narrative. As the discomfort and hostility wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket, I felt detached, an observer in my own life, watching the family I once adored crumble under the strain of unaddressed grievances and unexpressed emotions. I stormed out, tears cascading down my cheeks as the darkened evening air hit me. I didn't hear the poker-faced exchanges or the strained whispers following my exit. I simply wrapped my arms around my knees under the stars, wondering if I had truly ruined the dinner or merely laid bare the fractures that had always lurked beneath the surface, awaiting the perfect moment to shatter our fragile facade. As the night wore on, the moon hung heavy with judgment, and deep down, I felt it, the feeling that perhaps we were all broken, cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words, yet desperate to pretend we were fine. But for one fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I wished someone would have just acknowledged the depth of my hurt, instead of dismissing me as the antagonist of the family drama and making me wonder if, maybe, it was time to stop pretending those cracks didn't exist. The reality was, we each wore our own masks. Uncle Greg wore his of laughter while my family donned theirs of indifference, and that night, I unveiled mine, the one marred by hurt but precious in its truth, and I realized, maybe, the real tragedy wasn't in my smile but in the silence that had allowed them to linger. I never thought my wedding would end in chaos, but when my cousin Lisa showed up in a blood-red gown that clashed with the white theme of my ceremony, it felt like I'd walked into a horror movie instead of my dream day. I had been preparing for this moment for months, pouring my heart and soul into every detail, from the flowers to the music, all meticulously designed to evoke the purest enchantment, while I floated down the aisle in the lace gown I had envisioned since childhood, the embodiment of everything I had ever wanted. I remember the moment I spotted Lisa, standing smugly in the doorway of the venue with that gaudy dress that mirrored the sinister beauty of a vampire in some cheap film. I felt the air chill around me, my stomach twisting with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Didn't she know this day wasn't about her? The whispers of my friends buzzed in my ears, murmurs of disdain that fed my fury as I approached her, my carefully cultivated smile now plastered on my face like a mask. "Lisa, why are you here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, knowing the photographer was capturing every moment. "I thought it'd be a nice surprise," she replied, her tone dripping with faux innocence. At that moment, I remembered every family gathering where Lisa had overshadowed me, every snide comment she had made that belittled my choices, and I resolved that today would be different. My heart raced as I glanced back at my fiancé, who had excused himself to handle a family emergency but had assured me moments before that he couldn't wait to see me in my dress. Deep down, I didn't want to cause a scene, but her presence felt threatening, malignant, like she was festering in the happy blooms of this day, ready to checkmate me. As I took a step closer, Lisa's eyes flashed with that familiar defiance that prickled the nape of my neck. "What's your issue?" "It's just a color," she responded, feigning ignorance, but the challenge in her voice stoked the fire brewing inside me. "It's not just a color, it's a wedding." I shot back, my fury bubbling to the surface as I wrestled with the decision weighing on my conscience. A part of me was screaming to turn back, to let it slide and just enjoy the day, but another part clung to the bubbling rage, a sense of justice that demanded action. "Leave. Now," I spat, my fingers trembling as I clenched them into fists. The guests' eyes locked onto us, an audience drawn into an unfolding drama that felt vividly alive as whispers rippled through the crowd, but rather than fear, I felt a surge of adrenaline at reclaiming my day, my moment. Lisa's facade cracked, anger bubbling up beneath her flawless skin as she opened her mouth to retort, but all I could think about was how tired I was of being walked over, tired of being the unobtrusive cousin, the forever witness to her eclipses, tired of everything that had been unsaid over the years. "You're making a mistake. This is ridiculous. You're ruining your own wedding. Over something so petty," she shouted, her voice cutting through the whispers, drawing me closer to confrontation. I could see the shock on the faces of a few of my aunts, the mixture of gasps and raised eyebrows filling the room with anticipation, but I had crossed the threshold, I couldn't stop now. With every ounce of resolve I could muster, I turned my back on her, striding toward the wedding coordinator, whose eyes widened in disbelief and then mirrored my determination. "Security, please," I commanded, my heart drumming like a war cry as I heard Lisa hiss behind me, the noise echoing with the venom of a snake cornered, but I pressed on. I knew what having her there meant. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about the years of her putting me in the shadows. Moments later, two burly men approached, their expressions neutral yet ready, and when they were instructed to escort Lisa out, the look of hurt and fury painted her face as she went limp, her shock overwhelming her defiance. "You'll regret this," she spat as she was guided out, each word a dart aimed at my heart, as I stood there, shaking but finally feeling light, the burden of her specter lifted from my shoulders, the weight of my family's toxicity unfurling in the dust behind her. The ceremony resumed, but I could feel the eyes of my relatives boring into my back, the murmurs of disapproval hanging in the air thick as fog, and I couldn't tell if they were aggrieved by my actions or secretly relieved to be rid of the drama Lisa seemed to constantly bring. My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. The moment of triumph had morphed into a shadow of regret, the whispers of bridezilla and family tension stirring uncontrollably around me like a whirlwind of judgmental stares. As the vows were exchanged and I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wouldn't take this lightly, especially with her threatening words hanging heavy in the air. After the ceremony, as the reception blossomed around me in joyful chaos, laughter, dancing, and so many smiles, my joy felt marred by the creeping shadow of guilt. Could I really celebrate a day that, in some way, felt marred by the act of banishment? I tried to brush away the thoughts, focusing instead on the love swelling in my chest for my husband and the genuine moments shared with our friends, but Lisa's presence loomed heavily in my mind like a specter waiting to strike. Days turned into weeks, and just as I thought I could forget about the wedding drama, my phone buzzed late one night, draining the color from my face. It was a group text from my family. My heart raced as I opened it to find a picture of Lisa in that hideous, blood-red gown, with the caption, "Some weddings should be cancelled." My stomach dropped like a stone as her slander spread through our family like wildfire. The rising tide of animosity was making its way toward me, wrapping around my throat, threatening to suffocate the joy I had fought for. Each Sunday dinner became an arena of cold silence, excluding me from family conversations as I was framed as the villain, and while I was initially defensive, the weight of isolation left me gasping. The day finally came when I was invited to a family gathering with an air of dread. As I stepped through the front door, I could practically feel the judgment dripping from the ceiling fixtures. I quietly made my way to the living room, my heart thundering loudly against my ribcage as I caught sight of Lisa, clad in white this time, sitting smugly at the center of the table like some dark queen surveying her territory. The tension gripped me like an iron fist, clenching my heart as unwelcome memories spiraled back. Her smirk twisted with cruelty was overwhelming, laying bare the extent of her hunger for vengeance. I stood frozen in place, contemplating my next move when Lisa's eyes met mine with a glint of sadistic glee, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "Oh look, the bride graces us with her presence. Didn't you know weddings are supposed to be about everyone?" she quipped, laughter bubbling around her like a toxic potion, and just like that, the room shifted, murmurs erupting anew as I felt their eyes darting with interest between us. Her words were daggers, driving my insecurities deeper, igniting an inferno of rage within me, but instead of striking back as I longed to, all I could muster was a weak smile. "I'm glad to see you, too, Lisa," I managed to reply, forcing the words to escape, every syllable leaving a bitter taste in my mouth while her laughter washed over me like a tide, depending on the whispers of my family to feed her power. As the evening wore on, I noticed that my cousin didn't relent, sowing discord with poisoned words, planting unease in the hearts of my loved ones that grew more potent with every sip of wine. When I left that night, I felt the confines of my own family closing in, shadows whispering ever so softly, was I really the villain? But the truth was, standing at the edge of that wedding day, I had fought for myself in a world that always sidelined me, and even if the consequences were grave, I couldn't say I didn't deserve my moment of victory, however fleeting. So, AITA for having my cousin thrown out of my wedding? I don't know yet, but as I drive away, the question trembles in my mind: what kind of family comes together by building their foundation on the bones of betrayal? Last Thanksgiving, I found myself in a moral quandary that still chills my bones when I think back on it. My girlfriend, Mia, had a cherished family tradition of gathering every year at her grandmother's sprawling old house in the woods, a house that everyone claimed was haunted, though Mia always laughed it off as just a local legend. This year, however, I had planned a weekend fishing trip with my friends, something we had organized weeks in advance and were all looking forward to. I felt torn. Should I attend the obligatory family gathering where I'd be the outsider, or honor my pre-existing commitment? In a moment of selfishness, I chose my friends over her family's tradition, hoping it wouldn't cause too many ripples in our relationship. As soon as I made the decision, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I was already feeling bad when I woke up Thanksgiving morning to a deluge of messages and missed calls from Mia, her voice frantic as she told me her grandmother had fallen ill and there wouldn't be any gathering. Instead, she encouraged me to enjoy my trip, but guilt clawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been supportive enough. The fishing trip was almost as disappointing as it was cathartic. Every cast of my line reminded me of the warmth of family, and all I could picture was Mia's disappointment plastered across her face. As the day dragged on, though, I dismissed my worries, shrugging them off with my friends, feigning laughter as they told ghost stories around the campfire. But as night swallowed the camp in darkness, I noticed something odd, a sudden, chilling silence in the woods. The crickets stopped their chirping, and the wind held its breath. I could swear I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. Unease settled like lead in my stomach. In an attempt to shake the feeling, I stepped away from the fire, venturing into the trees on the pretext of needing to find a restroom. It wasn't long before I found myself walking deeper into the woods than intended, the moonlight barely cutting through the branches overhead. Each step was heavy, as if something sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the dim light. I turned back, heart racing, but that's when I heard the first of the whispers, soft, echoey, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Come play with us," it called, in a sing-song voice that sent icy chills down my spine. My blood ran cold as I immediately thought of the ghost stories my friends were telling. What if we had ventured too far into something that shouldn't be disturbed? I quickened my pace, trying to shake it off, but the whispers followed me back, only growing louder and more insistent. I stumbled upon what looked like an old, decrepit shack, forgotten and crumbling, draped with vines. It felt like a bad idea, but something pulled me closer, against my better judgment. Knocking on the rotten door, I felt an unnatural chill seep through my skin. The door creaked open without my touch, revealing an empty room consumed by shadows, where sunlight dared not intrude. I hesitated but stepped inside, curiosity overpowering fear. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, every instinct screamed for me to leave, but the whispers had morphed into a haunting melody that enchanted me. I turned towards a dim glimmer at the back, only for the door to slam shut behind me, locking me in darkness. Panic surged as I rattled the door, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The whispers turned to gasps, a cacophony that reverberated off the walls. Then, just like that, they formed words, "You shouldn't have come here." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw them, children, their faces pale and hollowed, drifting through the cracks in the walls, their eyes void of warmth, staring into my soul. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them whispered, clutching my leg with a cold, trembling hand. I felt sick. This place was a prison, a nightmare trapped inside a nightmare, echoing with the spirits of those who had lost their way. I fought against the whispers, pushed against the walls of darkness, the memory of Mia losing its hold on me as the weight of despair thickened the air. I couldn't let her down, but I felt tethered to this cursed place, as if its despair were latching onto my essence. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. My friends had come looking for me. I cried out, "Help me!" But my voice was drowned in the whispers. The door rattled as they struggled to open it. And, in a moment of clarity, I realized I had to fight back against whatever this place was trying to take from me. Summoning my last reserve of strength, I hurled against the door one final time, battering it as cold fingers released their hold. I felt space open up, light cutting through the darkness. My friends pushed through, pulling me into the safety of the night. Breathless and trembling, I fell to my knees, gasping for air while the shack stood ominously behind us, silent and still. I could still hear the whispers as they faded, mingling with the wind. "You shouldn't have come," echoed softly. Shaken, I collected myself as my friends were confused, asking what had happened. I only managed to tell them I'd gotten lost when I realized I'd been gone too long. I didn't dare tell them about the whispers, about the children, about the darkness, fearing they might have walked into our very own horror story. The next day, I returned to Mia, guilt seeping into every moment. When she asked how my trip went, I smiled faintly and said it was good, suppressing the fear clawing at my insides. A few days later, her family sent out a notice that they would be selling the old house. Apparently, her grandmother had died the night I'd gotten lost. The unease returned, wrapping its fingers around my throat as the fog of dread settled back in. I realized then that I was haunted not just by the spirits of that place, but by the decision I'd made, the choice to ignore something important, something that cost more than just a gathering. To this day, the whispers linger in the back of my mind, a reminder of the tradition I snubbed, the pain I caused. I sometimes wonder if part of me is still trapped inside that shack, lost among the shadows, and I can't help but bring it up to my friends, hoping they will understand someday. But deep down, I know the truth, it's too late for that. I never thought Thanksgiving would be the day everything would unravel, but here we are, just a few days away from the holiday when my brother decided to bring his new girlfriend into the family fold. Now, Logan had always been a bit impulsive, jumping from one relationship to another like a child on a trampoline, but this new girl, Tara, was something else. Our family is tight-knit, built on love and respect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her. It started a few weeks ago at a family barbecue. Tara showed up uninvited, slinking into our backyard in a low-cut dress and high heels, her laughter too loud and forced. I remember my wife, Sarah, greeting her with a warm smile, the kind that melts the heart, but Tara, with a dismissive wave, merely rolled her eyes, shooting back a caustic remark about how basic the whole event was. I felt the atmosphere freeze, Sarah's smile faltered, and the warmth of family quickly turned to awkwardness, the kind you feel in the pit of your stomach when someone's just been insulted in a room where everyone should feel safe. Despite the tension, I shrugged it off. Relationships take time, maybe she was just a little too much wine and not enough maturity. But then, the comments kept coming. It was like she had a vendetta against my wife, each word woven into a tapestry of disdain. At the next family gathering, she brought up how funny it was that I had the same job for 5 years, as if my dedication to our family's financial security was laughable, but, of course, Logan, ever the oblivious one, just laughed along. My heart raced as I watched Sarah's face contort with hurt. I approached Logan later and voiced my concerns, but he dismissed me, insisting I was being overprotective. It escalated from there, and I couldn't take it anymore. I made it clear, Tara wasn't welcome at our Thanksgiving dinner. This was a day for family, love, and gratitude, not taunts and jabs at the dinner table. When I broke the news to Logan, he went quiet, his face morphing into disbelief and anger, like I'd slapped him. "You can't just dictate who I can date," he exploded, red-faced and incensed. I stood my ground. "I'm not dictating anything, I'm protecting my family." Our conversation devolved into a fight, complete with accusations of me being controlling and unfair. It spiraled until we were both shouting, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, that I was pushing him away. But then he brought Sarah into it, saying that if she couldn't handle a little teasing, maybe I shouldn't have married her. That hit harder than any insult Tara had thrown, and I felt an icy rage boil inside me. Thanksgiving came, the air crisp and chilly, and I still buzzed with anger. Sarah was tentative around me, unsure of how to ease the tension brewing like a storm above our family eagle's nest, as she called it. I thought about all that Tara had put her through, how she had disrespected the very foundation of our lives together. The day of Thanksgiving dawned bright, but the shadow of the upcoming confrontation loomed large. I spent the day cooking, the sense of turkey and stuffing filling our home, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Logan, wondering if he'd take the high road or wash his hands of our family tradition. Then, the doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. There he stood, all confident bravado, with Tara clinging to his arm like a leech. I opened the door, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Hey, Logan. Happy Thanksgiving," I said, already regretting every bit of small talk that was about to ensue. "Thanks, man, good to see you," he replied, his voice leeching with tension as he glanced at my face for any sign of approval. Tara, however, was a different story. Rather than grace myself with a simple hello, she leaned in close to me and whispered, "You're really upset I'm here, aren't you, sweetie?" In a tone so saccharine it made my teeth ache. I could taste the bile rising in my throat as the words hung thick in the air. I forced a laugh, but inside, I was battling the monster of rage swarming my insides. I ushered them inside and busied myself with the preparations, Sarah already setting the table with an uncharacteristically somber expression. Tara breezed around the house, commenting on the decorations, how they looked cheap, as if she had any room to talk, and I was ready to snap. Dinner came, and we all settled down, tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Small talk morphed into a battlefield, and as Tara consumed her plate, every word dripped with thinly veiled mockery directed at my wife until Sarah excused herself and left the table. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, and something inside me snapped. I stood up so hard my chair toppled over. "Tara, if you can't show my wife respect in her own home, you don't deserve to be here and neither does Logan," I spat, all of my pent-up frustration exploding in a mixture of protective love and seething anger. The table fell silent, forks frozen in midair, as Logan shot out of his chair, flaring with indignation. "You're being unreasonable. She's my girlfriend," he screamed, the table shaking under the weight of his fury. But it was Tara that caught me off guard when she leaned back and said, honestly, Your life sounds pathetic. I feel sorry for your wife. My heart dropped like lead, the air became thick with something heavy. Was it hatred or contempt? I took a breath, steadying myself. You're right, Tara, I do feel sorry for you. You've managed to entangle yourself with a man who clearly doesn't see the damage you're doing. Logan looked stricken, staring between us, torn. That was when I reached my breaking point, turning to him and saying, "You deserve better than this, and so does she. I'm not the bad guy here, you are. I'll choose family over a petty squabble with a woman who can't respect my wife." I suddenly felt hollow and exposed, a dark mantle of anger and shame wrapping around me. Logan shook his head in fury, and I saw a ripple of realization cross his face, the anger twisting into a profound confusion. Tara stood there, smugly, as if to say she had just won a twisted game of chess where she expected to claim the crown. That's when I kicked them out, a moment that felt both immensely satisfying and eviscerating at the same time. I slammed the door behind them, breathing heavily, my heart racing faster than it had in years as I faced the fallout. I turned to find Sarah framed in the kitchen doorway, her face a landscape of conflicting emotions, pride, sadness, and relief, all tangled into a sorrowful smile. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as we held each other's gaze, and in that moment, I knew we could withstand anything, while all I could think about was whether I had chosen rightly for my family. Maybe I wasn't in the wrong after all. The evening faded into laughter, warmth, and heads bowed in thanks, filled with new traditions where respect governed the values we all held dear. A thin veil hung over the doorway where resentment no longer dared cross. I wasn't planning on going to my family's Thanksgiving dinner this year. I had been avoiding my relatives since that summer when my cousin Jake had found the old family recipe book in my grandmother's attic, the one marked with an odd symbol on the cover, like a twisted vine, which he insisted we use for the pumpkin pie, but I shrugged him off, dismissing any thoughts of using something that felt so out of place in a holiday tradition. Still, after weeks of nagging from my mother, I reluctantly agreed to attend, convinced that it would simply be a classic fight over politics and the same old complaints about how I was still single in my mid-20s. Yet, as the last rays of autumn sunlight dipped below the horizon and I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, a strange feeling twisted in my stomach, an instinct warning me that something was lurking just beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family gathering. I walked into the house, smelling the familiar aromas of roast turkey and stuffing, which should have felt comforting but instead only heightened my unease, every chuckle shared over the table echoing like an uninvited specter mocking me. When dessert was announced, I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as Jake was called upon to serve the pumpkin pie he had so wickedly insisted on preparing. I watched him slice it, the knife sliding through it like it was soft butter, revealing an unusual number of seeds embedded within, but no one else seemed bothered by it as they dove eagerly into their helpings, laughter fading to a low murmur as I glanced around the table, noticing Jake getting more animated as he spoke about this special pie, whispering how the recipe had been passed down for generations, but the glee in his voice had an unsettling edge I couldn't quite place. I felt compelled to try it, despite the gnawing voice in my head screaming for me to stop, so I reluctantly took a slice, the flavor exploding in my mouth, sweet yet somehow earthy, its richness unsettling yet addictive. As I swallowed, a dangerous lump formed in my throat, a panic rising when I caught Jake watching me, a smirk crossing his lips that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. The room felt claustrophobic, laughter morphing into distant chatter as I tried to maintain a smile, feeling the heaviness of the pie settle in my stomach like an anchor, each passing moment dragging me deeper into a pit of dread until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood abruptly, the sound of my chair scraping against the wooden floor tearing through the haze of conversation, and declared I was leaving, my heart racing as Jake's smile seemed to widen impossibly, genuine concern now masking a flicker of something darker. As I hurried out, I could hear my family's confused voices behind me, but all I could think was that I needed to get away from the house, the laughter that once filled it now sounding like derisive whispers in my ears. Storming out into the cool air, I felt both dizzy and wired, plunging into my car and slamming the door, my eyes darting back at the house lit up like a misplaced island of warmth in the dark, a beacon that now felt utterly sinister. It was only when I pulled out of the driveway that I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw Jake standing on the porch with a wide, sickening grin, the odd symbol from the recipe book now burned into my memory, and with every passing moment, the twisted reality began to settle in. What had he really put in that pie? I drove for what felt like hours, heart racing and mind racing faster, the thought of venturing back home making my stomach churn anew, but something inside told me to drive somewhere safe, somewhere normal. After pulling into the nearest gas station, I stumbled inside, seeking solace in the flickering fluorescent lights, but as I approached the cashier, my heart sank when I saw the subtle, knowing smirk on the cashier's face, his fingers idly tapping rhythmically on the counter almost like a signal, and everything that had felt odd lately crashed down on me, the feeling of familiarity, of dread, consuming me whole the second that cashier leaned forward and whispered, low and conspiratorial, "You shouldn't have left, the seed will find its way back to you." I bolted from the station, frantically spitting the words, "What did you mean?" into the window, but only the howling wind answered back, beckoning me home as the road stretched before me like a sinister path. When I finally returned home, the house loomed larger than before, shadows creeping across the porch like fingers grasping for the night. My family's laughter echoed again, but this time it felt warped, a cacophony of invasive whispers, relentlessly urging me to step inside. I pushed through the door and stepped into the dining room, where the remnants of our abandoned dinner remained. The pumpkin pie sat at the center, untouched and glistening in the dying light, looking more like a trophy than a dessert, and my family greeted me with smiles that felt jagged and twisted, eyes glinting as if they were anticipating something I was all too terrified to comprehend. There, at the head of the table, Jake's expression was almost a riddle, a puzzle formed of sinister delight, when he beckoned me forward, commanding me to take a seat, but every instinct within me screamed to run away. I could feel tendrils of darkness wrapping around my limbs, slowly pulling me down into the chair like glue, insistent, as the pie appeared to glare at me, glare with seated familiarity that echoed the night of shadows that still loomed over the house. The last thing I saw before everything spiraled into an unending void was Jake lifting the knife, that same wicked grin plastered across his face as he prepared to serve another slice, my scream of an unrecognizable foreboding cutting through the atmosphere, but dread pooled in my stomach as I knew, at that moment, the seed had begun to grow. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece at the last minute would lead to the nightmare that I am now living in. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday night. I had been looking forward to a solo evening binge watching my favorite shows, just curled up in my blanket with a bowl of popcorn, when my sister called. She was in a panicked frenzy because her plans with friends had fallen through at the last minute and she needed someone, anyone, to watch her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I hesitated, knowing full well that Lily's recent behaviors had made me uncomfortable. In the past few months, she'd been acting strangely, saying odd, almost unsettling things, like how she saw shadows move in the corners of her room or how her dolls would talk to her about things she couldn't possibly have known. I always shrugged it off as childhood imagination or just an overactive mind, but something in my gut twisted at the thought of being alone with her for several hours. "I can't," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "I have plans." The voice on the other end didn't take it well. My sister began to plead, insisting that I was being selfish, but I stood my ground. "It's just one night," I thought as I hung up, relieved until I glanced out the window and saw a shadow pass by my front door. It felt ridiculous, I told myself, it was just the wind or some stray cat, maybe even my imagination running wild, but then I heard a light tapping at the glass. I brushed it off as the tree branches swaying in the evening breeze, or maybe just my overactive mind playing tricks on me, until the tapping became a steady knock. My heart raced as I cautiously peeked through the peephole, and for a split second, I saw a small figure standing there, swaying slightly under the porch light. Instinctively, I swung open the door to confront whatever was there, only to see nothing. Just an empty porch, the night air wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. Dismissing everything as some childish prank or a figment of my imagination, I locked the door, shaking my head at my foolishness. I turned back to the TV, trying to immerse myself in the glow of the screen, but kept feeling that sense of dread resting at the back of my mind. As I settled back into the sofa, I convinced myself it was just nerves from the confrontation with my sister. But the unease lingered. I could feel it pressing against my chest, suffocating me as the night dragged on. I decided to distract myself with a few episodes before bed, but just as I'd settled in, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, text after text flooding in. "Please, I'm desperate. Lily's acting strange. I need help. Where are you?" My stomach twisted as I read her frantic messages. I was about to reply when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of giggles, soft and high-pitched, floating from somewhere outside my window. My heart thumped painfully against my rib cage, and I stood up, moving closer to the window to peer out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows pooling at the foot of the trees in my yard. But then my eyes caught a flash of something pale, and I noticed it wasn't just shadows dancing in the wind, it was Lily, standing at the edge of my lawn, her hair tangled over her face, her little hands clutching her doll, which seemed impossibly larger than her. Panic erupted in my chest as I realized she'd somehow gotten here despite my refusal. I rushed to the door, flinging it open to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat when I saw her face. She was smiling, and it was wrong, too wide, contorted in a way that felt inhuman, and her eyes glinted in the dark like they were lit from within. "Auntie," she shouted, her voice echoing eerily, sounding less like a child and more like an echo of something dark. "Come play with us." "Us?" I stammered, my stomach churning, but before I could process what was happening, she tilted her head, and the darkness around her seemed to shudder, hundreds of little whispers threading through the air like icy fingers. I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that she wasn't alone. I'd read stories about evil things hiding in the guise of children. I stepped back instinctively, heart racing, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were vacant, swirling like storm clouds. "Don't be scared, Andy. I've brought my friends," she purred, the shadows behind her deepening and looming closer. Panic coursed through my veins, and I slammed the door, retreating to the safety of my home, my mind spinning with the horror of what I had seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a child's folly, a trick of the light, but the knocking started again, more insistent this time. It wasn't a steady knock, though, it felt like fingers, hundreds, scratching at the door, their whispers creeping through the cracks. I fumbled for my phone, contemplating calling my sister, but what would I say? Her daughter was out there with friends? I needed to think. The second I gathered myself to move toward the kitchen for some water, the lights flickered ominously, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before they returned. That was when I heard the unmistakable sound of giggling again, now layered with whispers, words tumbling into one another that sent my heart racing. I had to open the door, reassure Lily somehow, tell her it was all okay, but when I cautiously opened it again, instead of the small child, I was met by a hollow laugh that sent ice through my bones. The porch was empty, yet there was a chill in the air that spoke of menace, something lurking just beyond the light. "Auntie, come out and play," echoed through the night, and my instincts screamed for me to retreat. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I shut the door, bolting it securely and retreating further into my home, but I could still feel those eyes, those countless eyes watching through the dark, just waiting. I stumbled through the hallway to find a weapon, anything that could offer me a sense of security, when I noticed something on the floor. A small shadow lay near my feet, casting an impossible silhouette on the wall. It was Lily's doll, the one she always carried, its glassy eyes glittering even in the dim light. I recoiled in horror as the whispers intensified, now clearer and rising to a frenzy. "She's not yours anymore. We want her home. Come out, come out." They wrapped around my thoughts, making me feel warm, comfortable, even as dread clawed at my throat. I couldn't let them have her. Suddenly, the lamps flickered, casting chaotic shadows across the room, bringing to life dark silhouettes that danced on the walls. Just when I thought the chaos had reached its peak, a chorus of giggles rang out, echoing all around me. I knew I had to act before it was too late. Rushing to the back door, I grabbed my jacket and flung it on, preparing to face whatever awaited in the dark. But the sounds grew louder, almost jubilant, a cacophony of twisted mirth that echoed through the hall. I gripped the handle and swung the door open, ready to confront whatever shadowy monstrosity awaited, but all I found was the glassy-eyed doll sitting on my step, its pale face turned towards me, grinning, with Lily's giggles chiming in the air. "You can't escape us, Auntie. We're already home." That's when I knew I had made the wrong decision. I choked on my breath, realizing that in refusing to watch my niece, I had invited terror into my life, and the very shadows I thought I'd escaped were now closing in, the whispers wrapping around me, claiming me for their own. Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways, an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions, rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later, a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. "I'm sorry," I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it." Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. "You're just saying that because of Mom," she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered: what if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, AITA for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? I've never thought I'd question my own sanity, but last summer changed everything. It all started when my best friend, Sarah, announced her engagement. Sarah was someone I grew up with, and we've shared everything from childhood secrets to adult heartbreaks, so when she asked me to be her maid of honor, I felt honored but terrified. The wedding was grand, extravagant by every measure, and I wanted everything to be perfect for her. That's when the dress came into the picture. The moment I saw it, I felt my stomach tighten. The floor-length silk gown was beautiful, but the plunging neckline and sheer sides left little to the imagination. For someone like me, who never felt comfortable in the spotlight, it was a nightmare. As if sensing my hesitation, Sarah insisted I look like a hot bridesmaid because the dress is meant to show off our beauty. I felt like a prop rather than a person, a mere decoration for Sarah's fairy tale, and as I stared at the dress hanging in my closet, I realized I couldn't bring myself to wear it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands, literally, sneaking some fabric from a craft store to alter the dress a bit. Nothing drastic, just enough to cover my shoulders and up the neckline slightly. I felt guilty but convinced myself that it was okay since I was still honoring the essence of the dress but adapting it to my own comfort. The night before the wedding, I stayed up late, stitching away, feeling proud of myself until dread settled in. What if Sarah saw it? Would she flip? I told myself that all would be fine, that this was just for me, for my confidence, but as I slipped into that gown the next day, I felt a chill run down my spine like I was about to walk into a lion's den. The venue was filled with laughter and shimmering lights, and the moment I stepped through the entrance, I could feel all eyes on me. But instead of ridicule or judgment, I saw nods of approval, murmured compliments about how elegant I looked. It was euphoric until I spotted Sarah, who stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief, her mouth moving but the words lost in the frantic music around us. Before I could process her reaction, she stormed over to me, seething. "Did you alter my dress?" she asked through gritted teeth, her voice devoid of warmth. I stammered, trying to explain how it was too revealing for my taste, but her expression hardened further. "You weren't supposed to change anything, this is my wedding." I felt the temperature in the room drop, and it became painfully clear that her dream of perfect bridesmaids and perfection had been shattered by someone who dared to adapt their own version of beauty. As she dragged me outside, the laughter from the party faded into a distant echo, and it felt like I was about to be sentenced. "You made a mockery of me," she whispered fiercely. A part of me wanted to yell back, to explain that it was about comfort, not mockery, but all of the words seemed trapped in my throat. Before I could speak, she turned and raced back inside, leaving me outside, alone amidst the fading light. The next hour was a whirlwind of chaotic emotions. It disrupted the flow of the wedding entirely, while I stood there, shaking, feeling like a pariah. Guests started casting sideways glances in my direction, some whispering, while others just outright stared. That's when the uncertainty morphed into something darker. I knew I had crossed a line. The coldness from Sarah seeped deeper inside me as I replayed our confrontation and my own insecurity that led to this moment. Was I really the villain in this story? Or was I merely trying to reclaim a piece of my one fading sense of self at the expense of someone else's happiness? After the ceremony, I retreated to the bathroom, convinced I needed to gather my thoughts, but as I approached the mirror, I noticed something uncanny about my reflection. My altered dress, the fabric I thought was meant to help me, seemed to distort my own likeness in an almost grotesque manner. The neckline I was proud of now began to look jagged and monstrous, the sleeves felt like chains wrapping around me, pulling tighter and tighter. I blinked, and for a fleeting moment, I swore I saw another face, a twisted, smirking mask that looked like me but wasn't. I staggered back, suddenly feeling like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. Shaking my head, I took a breath, reassured myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear crawled deeper into my bones. When I finally left the bathroom, I found the reception room in chaos. Sarah was surrounded by a group of bridesmaids, enraged faces all around her, casting accusatory glances at me like I was the villain in their beloved tale. The apprehension in the air was palpable, every laugh a bit too sharp, every cheer unnaturally loud. Before I could even register what was happening, I heard whispers form into words, accusing me of sabotaging the wedding, of making my insecurities the focus of Sarah's big day, as if I was some attention seeker reveling in the chaos I'd concocted. In those moments, I felt their judgment slice through me like a dagger, and that's when I caught sight of my own reflection in the highly polished plates scattered across the tables. I looked at the corrupted image of myself in the dress, and suddenly it struck me, I wasn't merely altering a dress, I was trying to alter my reality, to fit into a world where I didn't belong, where beauty meant something else entirely, something that warped my very sense of being. The music played on, the chaos intensified, and I felt a desperate urge to escape, to shed the skin of my own creation. I turned and fled while they continued to hurl insults behind me, the laughter losing its warmth, becoming a cruel echo that taunted my every step. That night was a blur, a prison of my own making that left me shaken, haunted by the reflection of what I had become. The next morning, Sarah and I spoke. She never forgave me, claiming I ruined her day, that I should have understood the importance of sacrifices for the sake of friendship. But as we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that my desire to alter that dress, to claim my own narrative, had unleashed something far more sinister. I'd broken a bond not just with her, but with a version of myself who sought acceptance in a world where the beauty seemed so unforgiving, and I became a specter of that night, roaming through my thoughts, knowing in the deepest chambers of my mind that sometimes, you might not just alter a dress, you might alter the very fabric of who you are, and in doing so, you risk losing everything that you held dear. I never thought a simple conversation would spiral into a nightmare that would haunt me for years, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I was sitting in my homeroom, surrounded by the hum of morning chatter, when Jacob, the class clown with a well-deserved reputation for chaos, turned to me with a smirk that made my stomach drop. Just moments before, I'd finally managed to brush off the whispers about my appearance. My thick glasses and untamed hair were like red flags to my peers, an invitation for their cruelty. But when Jacob said it, I felt the world around me fall away. He called me a slur I thought I'd never hear directed at me, a word loaded with hate and ignorance, so vile it caught in my throat like the last bite of a bad meal. I was frozen, my heart racing, knowing that confronting him would only lead to more taunts, but doing nothing felt like accepting defeat. After class, I couldn't shake off that moment, that bite of venom that whispered to me that I was less deserving of respect simply for being different. Against my better judgment, I decided to go to my guidance counselor, Mrs. Perkins, a woman known for her warm smile and the jam-packed schedule of students desperate to be heard. She was trusted by many, or so I thought. I walked in, rehearsing my words, ensuring that I could convey the hurt without sounding too weak. But as I recounted the story, I noticed her expression shift. It seemed like understanding morphed into disappointment. "You need to speak to him directly," she said, her voice steady yet devoid of compassion, and for a moment, I thought I was being brave, but a sense of dread settled in my chest. The next day, Jacob approached me with his usual swagger, but something was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, an expectation that coiled around us like a noose. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on us, holding their breath like they were waiting for a fight or, worse, a spectacle. Jacob leaned in closer, a sneer on his lips, and whispered, "You told on me, didn't you?" His voice dripped with malice, and in that moment, I realized I had walked into a trap of my own making. As I tried to find my voice, to say that I only wanted to be treated with a shred of dignity, he laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the empty hallways, and my stomach twisted in a painful knot. The humiliation built with every laugh that chimed in around me. It was a familiar family of taunts, all mercilessly joining in, and I felt my standing as the target solidifying so solidly that it shook my core. I wanted to deny everything, to crawl into myself and disappear, but Jacob leaned in even closer, taunting me to deny it. I stumbled over my words, unable to fight back, and he responded by tossing out another slur, like throwing a stone into a glass house. His words shattered any belief I had in justice, and the following weeks turned into a blur of relentless bullying, an onslaught that transformed my once quiet school life into a daily battle of survival. The more I tried to advocate for myself, the worse it got. Whispers crept into the cafeteria, photoshopped images emerged on social media, and suddenly I was the joke of our school year. Each day, I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, a flimsy shield against the arrows of cruelty that seemed to fly directly in my direction. I lost friends, I lost joy, and I sat in silence while my name became synonymous with ridicule. I began dreading the walk through those school doors, feeling the heavy weight of shame, like a cloak that had been stitched together by every cruel word. It was as if every laugh in the hallway was a reminder that some stories have no heroes, only victims. I started seeing Mrs. Perkins less as an ally and more as a source of disappointment. Her suggestion echoed in my mind: had I been weak by telling her? By doing something? I felt caught in a web of self-loathing and guilt, one that twisted itself tighter every time I was labeled as a tattle or, worse, a coward. My trust in adults wore thin, slipping through my fingers like sand as I realized this cacophony of cruelty felt tolerated. Days bled into weeks, each worse than the last, until one fateful afternoon when Jacob decided to take things further. During gym class, in a cruel stroke of fate, he managed to coordinate a moment that would forever mark my life. I was paired with him for a team exercise. The moment he stepped closer, I could smell the sweat mixed with arrogance, a vile combination that churned in my gut. "Are you going to run away like a little brat?" he sneered, pouring scorn into those words, and every ounce of my resolve melted away. Instead of freezing, instead of standing tall, anger surged through me, fueled by weeks of torment and shame. In a fit of rage, I swung my arm, a clumsy, desperate act born from pain, but it landed hard against his shoulder. The room silenced as if time itself had held its breath. I couldn't take my eyes off his shocked face, and for a fleeting moment, I felt powerful. But any sense of triumph was short-lived. Before I knew it, he retaliated with venomous fists, turning that forgotten gymnasium into a cage of chaos. I'd become the villain in my own story, surrounded by chaos, and the teachers pulled us apart, leaving us sitting in opposite corners of the principal's office as the narrative twisted. I was labeled the aggressor, the troublemaker, while Jacob donned his martyr's mask of innocence. Moments later, under the fluorescent lights that seemed to mock me, I finally spoke up, fearing for my future yet again. I recounted everything, how I had tried to stand up, how I had only wanted help, but in the eyes of the adults, I was merely misbehaving. "This isn't my fault," I cried, the desperation in my voice ringing hollow under their indifferent gazes. I became the conversation topic in whispers during lunch, and a target in the anxiety-ridden dreams that plagued me every night. My friends distanced themselves, afraid of catching what they labeled my drama. I lived in isolation, cocooned in a construct of my own guilt, paralyzed by the need for validation while crumbling beneath the weight of blame. The dreams turned darker, the whispers morphed into chants echoing in my head. I began to wonder if maybe I did belong in the shadows, if Jacob had been right all along. A year went by, each day a collection of silent scars grafted into my soul, and just when I began considering leaving school altogether, a weird email appeared in my inbox, one that made my breath hitch and my heart race. It contained a recorded conversation between Jacob and a mutual friend, a confession made in chuckles and arrogance, affirming that he orchestrated the entire thing with malicious intent, to bring me down, to revel in my despair. In a world that had painted me into a corner, I emerged, holding this tiny, clipped audio, a talisman of truth. Part of me wanted to send it off, share it with everyone who had ever judged me, but fear laced my hands. Who would believe me? I could feel the familiar voice in my head saying it was all just my fault for ever speaking to the counselor, that I had become nothing more than someone to be ridiculed. But I couldn't let Jacob's cruel laughter win. The next morning, I stood there, heart pounding, as I played the recording from Mrs. Perkins, tears of rage spilling over. She listened, the colors draining from her face, each slur echoing like a drum roll at a dark circus act. Days later, the principal called an emergency assembly, and for the first time in so long, the power had shifted. I stood in front of the student body, fog settling behind my eyes as I recounted the truth, knowing there may be repercussions but refusing to be the puppet in this horrid tale any longer. The gasps around the gymnasium filled the space like a chasm of realization, and the terrible weight of how I had felt for so long began to lift like a dawn breaking through a long night. Jacob faced the consequences. Suddenly, my once silent monster wore chains, and slowly the whispers turned into empathy. But still, as I left the auditorium that day, I could feel the air around me stifled with the remnants of hatred and, for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited. It wasn't an end, it was just the beginning of understanding that sometimes, telling the truth, no matter how painful, can set you free. Yet, no matter how much I felt liberated from the chains he had forged, I knew that I would carry the scars of that battle forever. So, I ask you, AITA, for telling the guidance counselor my classmate called me a slur? Because somewhere deep down, I am still that kid whose heart raced at the thought of being silenced, and to this day, that fear lingers, waiting for its moment to return.